So first thing I want to do is obviously welcome everybody to today's webinar about a new book called The Wise Advocate, The Inner Voice of Strategic Leadership. And I guess what I want to ask you is, this is what happens when you put a neuroscientist, an executive coach, and a culture change expert together. The whole journey for us started about in 2006, actually, when we met for the first time at a neuro leadership conference. And we started asking the question about what's the relationship between neuroscience and being a good leader? And what is it about great leadership that we can actually explain from neuroscience and actually see it in your life? So that's what we set out to do, myself, Josie Thomson, Art Kleiner, and Dr. Jeffrey Schwartz. So let me introduce your two presenters today. So Dr. Jeffrey Schwartz is a really good friend of mine, and he's also one of the world's leading experts in neuroplasticity. He's the co-founder of the neuro leadership field, and he's a sought-after speaker and best-selling author of Brain Lock, and more recently, You Are Not Your Brain. And I met Jeff, as I mentioned before, in 2006 at the inaugural Neuro Leadership Summit in Asolo in Italy. And we've been collaborating to facilitate an online learning based on one of Jeff's best-selling books, You Are Not Your Brain. And we've been working on this book with Art Kleiner since 2012. Now, Dr. Schwartz has been practicing mindfulness within a structured cultural tradition for 5 years. He's a neuroplasticity expert, and he's also sustained that formal daily practice for at least an hour every day for 25 years. For me, Josie Thomson, I'm a change, resilience and mindset expert. I'm one of Australia's most in-demand executive coaches. I'm a sought-after international speaker. I'm a lifestyle author. I'm a businesswoman. I'm a mum and also a two-time cancer survivor. And I've applied a lot of the principles that we'll be covering with you in my work and also in my healing process. In the last 18 years, I've coached hundreds of executives and leaders to achieve massive personal and business breakthroughs. And I specialise in partnering with successful individuals and organisations to leverage skills and abilities towards exceptional outcomes in business, in leadership, and relationships. And I have completed studies in neuroscience myself. And really importantly, I've been applying these principles of our new book with leaders and with organisations. And I'm really proud to say that a lot of the case studies in the book is actually Brisbane based. So you'll be able to read all about them when you get your hands on your own copy. So today we think we have something unique that we want to share with you. And the webinar is based on our new book, The Wise Advocate, which is available on the 29th of January 2019. It's published by Columbia University Press, and the link to the book is on the bottom of the book on this slide. And you'll see also that there are actually several articles and videos that you can review, and we'll post those links in the comments section or the chat box for you to check out as well. So let's get started. Have you ever wondered what actually makes a great leader? You know, the kind of leader that people turn to for guidance, the kind of leader that people naturally trust, the one that engenders respect and commitment from others. What does it actually take to be that kind of leader? And I'm supposing that you're here today to find out. It has a lot to do with the kinds of decisions and choices that we make, particularly in difficult times. Now, a great leader is actually able to put themselves in the other person's shoes and make better choices. So how we make decisions in critical moments of choice, it turns out that many leaders, even excellent ones, they're not actually that aware of their own decision-making process as they could be. So when we looked at the neuroscience, it was clear that having a better understanding of how you come to those decisions is not only going to help you make wiser choices, but it's also the path to being a better leader. So think about right now, think about a critical decision that you need to make for your business at the moment. Now, it might be borrowing to launch a new venture, or it might be focusing a scattered enterprise in a single direction, or it might even be dealing with restructures. The best options are not obvious, and the consequences are not always crystal clear. So how do you actually go about making that decision? What do you need to take into account? Where you focus in these critical moments of choice determines not only the kind of solutions you come up with, but the kind of leader ultimately you become. So at critical moments of choice, leaders tend to go down one of two paths. They either go down a transactional path that focuses on what people want. Now, this is the path of expedience, and it's very useful in business. The other path is actually strategic, where leaders need to reflect not just on what people want, but also what they're thinking, who they are, and what's needed to meet the longer term goals. And it's when you link into our concept, which is the title of the new book, The Wise Advocate, which is where the magic happens. So let's define the concept of the whole book, which is the Wise Advocate. So what or who is the Wise Advocate is the immediate question. So connecting with your Wise Advocate, what is that? What does it actually mean? It means that you are being transparent with your thinking. You are aware of how you are thinking. And like Adam Smith's impartial spectator, it helps you see yourself as others see you from a third-person perspective of a first-person experience. Now, the phrase itself can actually be traced to the ancient Greek concept of parakletos, which is defined as an advocate or a counsellor who stood with an individual to help them manage difficulties or distress. Now, the Greeks also associated this concept with the quality of Sophia or wisdom. Now, in pop culture, it was also the inspiration for the talking cricket in the original Pinocchio that actually became Jiminy Cricket in the Disney production. So, but our Wise Advocate goes beyond what the impartial spectator does. The Wise Advocate that we talk about, it always has your best interest at heart. The Wise Advocate can see the bigger picture, including your inherent worth and capabilities. And it is always committed to you and your enterprise in the long term. So it's kind of difficult to describe. When I first got introduced to the concept of Wise Advocate, it was that wise inner narrative, that concept of self that is beyond self, that can see beyond the moment, that can see the bigger picture at all time, and can also see what's in the best long-term interest of all stakeholders. So we've distinguished that there is this concept of the Wise Advocate, but let's talk a little bit more about what it is and how do you move from transactional to strategic leadership with this thing called the Wise Advocate. Well, when you're moving from transactional to strategic leadership, it often takes form of calling on your Wise Advocate. So the thing about the Wise Advocate, it is an aspect of your attentive mind that can see the bigger picture, including your worth and capabilities. It's like your wise inner guide. Now, it is dispassionate. It helps you see yourself as others can see you. And as I said before, it's like a third-person perspective on a first-person experience. But unlike Adam Smith's impartial spectator, it also cares for you. It is actually committed to you, and it's committed to your enterprise. So if you look at what I've put on the slide, when you actually consult your wise advocate, you actually have enough time to take the time to do that checking in. You also have the ability to tune in and to listen to that wise inner guidance system. And by doing that, you actually get better at tuning in, at connecting in with this concept of thinking about what you're thinking about, which is a concept that we're calling metacognition, where you think about what you're thinking about. And then you actually dive into another concept that we introduce in the book called meta-attention, when you actually start paying attention to what you're paying attention to, which is really critical, because what you'll notice is that when you're operating in a transactional context, you're usually paying attention to a lot of noise and a lot of activity, and there's not a lot of stillness and quiet in that space. Eventually, when you really get good at connecting into this concept of wise advocate, you actually become aware of how you're paying attention to your awareness. So you become aware of your awareness, how you're being aware, and that's meta-awareness. And that's where we also talk about another construct, which we'll mention in a moment, called applied mindfulness. Now, each time you call on your wise advocate, you actually strengthen that part of your brain. There are specific brain circuits associated with tuning into the wise advocate. And you actually start to develop the aspect of your mind that resources you and enables you to make it easier to call on the wise advocate more readily. So the wise advocate really does encourage you to make decisions in a much more rational way based on your overall best interest long term. Okay, so transactional is much more short term, goal orientation, whereas wise advocate is always looking what's in the greater good for the greater time, greater interest. It's always there, even when you're not paying attention to it, but you're just not tuning in. You actually have to seek it out. You actually have to listen for it. You actually have to call for it. Now, the act of seeking your wise advocate is itself a mental activity that's likely to improve your leadership and also you as a person. And you can ultimately play that same role as wise advocate for your organization. So let's have a look at the layers of leadership. What we've observed when we were putting this book together is that there are 4 distinct patterns of leadership, well, the thinking of leadership, which you can regard as successive floors of a building. The higher you rise, the greater your facility as a strategic leader. So on the lower ground, we're driven by instinct and emotion. Now, we often think of this as an immature leadership style. And at this level, you tend to ignore your wise advocate. As you move up to the low ground, we come to what we call the transactional leadership style. Think of this as the foyer of a building, which is noisy and busy, where everyone comes and goes. Now, here, people are making deals and they're solving problems. At this level, you may consult your wise advocate when it seems relevant to you. But then as you move up the floors of the building, your perspective starts to change. Whoops, I'm going the wrong way. Here we go. We can see further. It's less noisy and you can hear your wise advocate more clearly. Now, at the high ground, the focus is on improving your ability as a leader and the performance of your organization. So you are now transitioning to what we call strategic leadership, and you're being driven by long-term results, not so much about expedience here. At this level, you tend to consult your wise advocate when you make important decisions and when you manage other people. At the very top of the building is the higher ground. So you can see we've got lower ground, low ground, higher ground, higher ground. Now at the higher ground, this is where you can see the furthest. Now there is little up here to impede your view. It's like being in the penthouse. At this level, you consciously and habitually consult your wise advocate, and you play the role of the wise advocate for the larger organization. So the thing about this is it's about focus. So when you focus in critical moments of choice really matters, and so does appreciating the concept of self-directed neuroplasticity. Now, where you focus in critical moments of choice actually determines not only the kind of solution that you come up with, but the kind of leader ultimately that you become, and the kind of organization that you are fostering. So with each major decision, you make a choice. And the focus of your attention at these moments of choice actually builds your capacity to be an effective leader. And the choice you make today will influence the kind of choices you make in the future. And this is what neuroplasticity is all about. When you follow a pattern of mental activity repeatedly, the related parts of the brain actually wire together. So the more you use it, the more you enforce it. Yay, he's here.
Yeah.
Okay, welcome, Jeff. Do you want to take over from this slide?
Okay, so self-directed neuroplasticity is all about focused attention and the effect that it has on your brain. When you focus in critical moments, it's the choice, yes, but really it's the directed attention that changes your brain. And for right now, I guess we'll just leave it at that. I mean, there are deep scientifically based ways in which I can make that statement, and why I coined this term self-directed neuroplasticity. But the one-line summary is the power is in the focus. When you focus your attention, you create new brain circuitry. And when you change how you were focusing your attention as new skills arise, you wire those new skills into your brain through focused attention. Next. Okay, so now this is really the big slide right here that really shows how what I just said gets actualized in a business context. So basically, are you going to be focusing your attention in a low road manner, which means all of your attention is directed towards problem solving, making deals in some very concrete here and now fashion, not that forward looking, seeking expedient solutions, pleasing the right people most efficiently. So that's very important. We never downplay that. We never say that's not important. We know it's important, but it doesn't build the wise advocate function, and it also strengthens the part of the brain which also sends us, as we're going to learn in a little while, wrong brain messages, deceptive brain messages, distracting brain messages, not goal-oriented brain messages. The wise advocate, on the other hand, which is the, your inner guide, where you're in dialogue with the aspect of your mind that is goal-oriented and has a third-person mindful perspective. When you do that, you consult your inner voice, have inner dialogue, create constructive narratives, and that inner voice of strategic leadership works with you to seek the right long-term result and make your decisions accordingly. And when you do that, you're actually focusing attention in ways that strengthen parts of your brain related to two mental skills that we're going to detail in a moment: executive function and mentalizing. Next.
Okay. So these are the specific brain systems involved in those two pathways. So the high ground and the low ground exist both in the mind as patterns of mental activity, and also in the physical brain as circuits of mental activity. So the high road, it operates at the top part of the brain. The low road operates at the bottom part of the brain. Now, because the mind and the brain are so closely interrelated, we don't show separate loops for them. Instead, the two primary loops in the graphic here, the high ground and the low ground, represent both the mind and the brain. So each of the loops becomes stronger and thus easier to follow when you pay more attention to it, which is what Jeff was just talking about. So each loop connects three primary centers of mental activity, represented by the circles. Now, in each circle, you'll see a bold name describing its essential function, such as the warning center there. Now, the name of the part of the brain associated with it, and in quotes and italics, the related mental experience. The warning center is part of both the systems. This center generates feelings. It's the gut level responses and the sense that something's wrong and maybe worth pursuing or avoiding. Now, we don't have time today to go into greater detail. However, if you're interested, we'll happily deliver a keynote or a workshop for your organization. We're also going to have trainings and IP licensing available very soon. So let's look at the actual mental activities involved in both the transactional and strategic leadership. Jeff?
Okay, so this is really getting into what aspects of how you focus attention will strengthen what parts of your brain. And the transactional, which is expedience, which is paying attention to the question, you know, what do I want? What do they want? And how are we going to basically get to an expedient win-win result? Again, never do we downplay that, but we just want to go beyond that. So when you do that, you're using a specific term, subjective valuation, which is simply just the neuroscience way of saying, what do I want? What do they want? In other words, what is valuable to them? What is relevant to them? But also know that the part of the brain that gets strengthened when you do that is largely linked to habit formation. And so a lot of this really becomes automatic. And that's what we're trying to do, is make you realize, yeah, good habits are extremely helpful and extremely important, but you don't want to just be a creature of habit. And then the other part of that is that this part of the brain, because it's so linked to your emotional brain, will also send in many distracting, deceptive messages that are not goal-oriented, that often are related to negative emotions, insecurities, and things that take you away from the big picture. Now, next, the strategic, on the other hand, is the high ground, which really involves a part of the brain that is literally physically higher up, more towards the top of the brain. And the three key terms there are executive function, which is goal-oriented thinking, which is executive is the one big word that is the same in neuroscience and in business, and it has to do with long-term planning and especially goal-oriented thinking. And one of the main parts of executive function that helps us maintain goal-oriented thinking is that part of the brain, the frontal cortex, especially the prefrontal cortex, is also the part that inhibits our mind from wandering onto non-goal oriented thoughts. So that's a key point to remember. To remain goal oriented, you really want to use executive function to inhibit and prevent your attention from wandering off goal oriented thoughts. Another very important point is a new word in neuroscience that's been very researched in the last 10 to 15 years is the term mentalizing. It has a very simple meaning. It means, what is that person thinking? What is he thinking? What is she thinking? What are they thinking? So it turns out that the different parts of the brain that are close together answer two different questions. What do they want versus what are they thinking? What do they want is transactional, low ground, lower part of the brain. What are they thinking is much more high ground, higher part of the brain, and linked into executive function and goal-oriented thinking. And then applied mindfulness is, of course, where we're really getting into the real strategic aspect. And that's when you start to think about your own thinking and really start to pay attention to how you're paying attention. And that's when we really get big picture. And are you paying attention to your wise advocate, which we call full mindfulness? So applied mindfulness is really mentalizing about yourself. Mentalizing is thinking about what other people are thinking. Applied mindfulness is mentalizing about yourself, which is a great entry path into mindfulness. What am I thinking? What am I paying attention to? And two key questions that distinguish these are, on the transactional side, what do I want? The famous management theorist Elliot Jacks did a lot of studies on the questions, what's the difference between the question, am I paid enough, and am I paid fairly? And we really point out that am I paid enough is really a transactional question. It's about what do I want. Strategic, though, is am I paid fairly, and that gets you into an objective, clear-minded way of thinking about function in organization. And so the question, am I paid fairly, activates a much more strategic aspect of your mental and brain function than the question, am I paid enough? Those kinds of distinctions become very important when we're trying to discern where in our mind and brain are we, on the transactional side or on the strategic side. And both are important, and we're trying to get them to interact constructively as we create a constructive narrative in consultation with the wise advocate.
Right.
Next.
So to develop access to your wise advocate, you actually have to shift your thinking. So notice the different questions here. This is a sample of the mental narratives that distinguish the two modes of thinking. So on the low ground, we're focused on our wants, all the desires of others. So we'll ask ourselves questions like, what do I want this? Will others want this? Is this valuable? Is this relevant? On the high ground, however, we reflect more on our thinking and on the thinking of others. So we ask different questions. We actually ask ourselves, well, what am I actually thinking? What am I planning to do? What are others thinking? And what are they likely to do? So you'll see that the low ground is much more expedient, it's more reflexive, it's more automatic, it's more habitual. Whereas on the high ground, it's a process that will lead to improved long-term outcomes. So let's consider, though, what can actually get in the way of tuning into the wise advocate. And it's what Jeff has already mentioned, the deceptive brain messages. So what are deceptive brain messages? Well, essentially, they are habitual thoughts, their impulses, their urges, and their desires. They feel like the truth, but they're likely to be false, and even when they're partially true. They take you away from your most important goals and intentions. In other words, they actually take you away from your true self and your true goals. And all those thoughts can become ingrained in your brain's habit center. And thus, they come to feel like the truth because their power comes from their habitual automatic nature. They just kick in, and they can be quite overwhelming. They can be quite like they just full on and take hold of your focus and attention if you're not mindful and if you're not careful. They're present in both individuals and organizations. So these could be thoughts, they could be impulses, they could be urges, they could be desires that are shared among people in a group or an organization that take on added power and influence, even though they're false and inaccurate, because of the way that they're repeated through conversation and through the culture. So let's look quickly at some examples. I'm just mindful of the time here. So some examples of individual and workplace deceptive brain messages. So some of the headings, if you like, that we've come up with is, one of them is misperceptions of risk. So we've got something called overconfident exceptionalism, where the narrative might sound like the old rules don't apply to us, there's no danger for us. Or we've got excessive risk aversion, and the narrative might be, we must prevent or prepare for every possible failure. And you can see what that's going to do to not just narrative, but to focus attention and behaviours and choices. Then we've also got misperceptions of values. So there's all or nothing thinking. So it could sound like it should be flawless or it won't have any value. It could also be about ticking the boxes. Does it comply with specification? If so, it's good enough. We also talk about misconceptions of proficiency. So we talk about entrenched insecurity. We are not effective now and we never will be. And that's a deceptive brain message. There's no room for improvement. We've also got a concept we talk about called mind reading, where the narrative might sound like everyone else shares my opinion because I'm just that good. And I'm sure you never hear about that one. And then we talk about misperception of validity, where we include things like emotional reasoning. So if it feels right, it must be true. And we talk about rigid rationalism, where the narrative could sound like, we came to this decision logically, so there will be no disagreement. And you've probably heard some of those narratives in your own organisations before. So that brings us to, well, how do we actually manage these deceptive brain messages? We manage these deceptive brain messages by applying a 4-step approach. Now, a very, very high-level overview of the 4 steps are here. So the first step is relabel, where we actually relabel these deceptive messages that travel along the low ground so that you can actually see them for what they are. They are simply deceptive messages. Then we go into reframing, where we reframe those messages to create a new narrative that will better serve you and your enterprise long term. Then we start refocusing attention repeatedly. So there's a movement to the high ground, which becomes habitual. Now we're accessing the wise advocate on a much more regular basis. And eventually we go to revalue, where we revalue your whole role and action within the larger enterprise. So in a nutshell, today we've introduced you to the wise advocate, your inner voice of strategic leadership. Now you can develop that habit of calling on your wise advocate when it matters most. Ultimately, you can move to the higher ground when you call on your wise advocate consistently and habitually. We've sought to give you a bit of an overview on the principles that underpin our new body of work. We've defined some of the overarching ideas, which has hopefully given you a general understanding of the voice of strategic leadership, in other words, the wise advocate, as well as some of the functions and priorities of the brain when you're leading on that high ground versus the low ground. And we've covered some concepts like the deceptive messages, and we've given you a very, very brief overview of the 4 steps. So before we close, we'd like to give you a moment of reflection right now. So take a moment now to capture your thoughts in terms of calling upon your wise advocate. It is actually a mental activity that can become habitual with practice. So how and when will you call on your inner wise advocate? And the second question we'd like you to consider is, how can you become a wise advocate in your organisation? If you're interested, there are several resources that we have available to you as well, which we will put in the comments or the chat box for you. Most of the information that we've covered with you today was adopted directly from our new book, The Wise Advocate, The Inner Voice of Strategic Leadership, which is being published on the 29th of January 2019 by Columbia University Press, and you will be able to order it, pre-order it right now, and the link is in the chat box. If you would like more information about keynotes or workshops about this body of work, or even being able to license some of the IP, please contact me. So in closing, I'd really like to thank you for attending today. I'd like to acknowledge you, Jeff, for your contribution today. And I wish you all well, and I look forward to celebrating your leadership on the higher ground with the inner voice of strategic leadership, your wise advocate. Goodbye for now.
Bye.